You may remember a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was as a consequence of me being an elected member of the Otago Regional Council, can I say, I received a missive from a group who called themselves Informed Leaders, 8 academics, none of whom lived, I might add, in the central Otago Lakes area, petitioning elected members, but also anybody who that they could, and when I say elected members, I mean from the sort of Prime Minister down to a lowly regional councillor, against a proposed new international airport that the Christchurch airport company are proposing to build at a place called Terrace. Now, Terrace is about, for those of you who know Central Otago, it's sort of about 35, 40 kilometres south of Wanaka and about 30 kilometres north of Cromwell. It's a large expanse of flat land which mostly has dairying, some viticulture upon it. But the idea being that an international airport was required in Terrace to meet future and anticipated tourism demand. Now, whether we like it or not, and most people do like it, there is a burgeoning tourism industry in this country, for which has in many ways saved our economy over the last, 3-4 decades, perhaps longer than that. It's always vied, tourism and the dairy industry have vied for being the premier, if you like, export earner for New Zealand, and they have provided obviously tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs in that time, and continue to do so. Well, the point is the world needs to eat, so dairying doesn't have to suffer so much the vicissitudes of fate, and there are more people growing into the middle classes of Asia as well. So the dairy industry continues to grow apace. They have ups and downs, but really not big downs and usually pretty good ups. So it continues to burgeon. But in 2020, obviously the tourism industry in New Zealand went through, well, you could only suggest to you a catastrophic, not so much failure, but decline. And we all know why. We decided to become, as part of our COVID response, the second hermit kingdom after North Korea. And we shut our borders. We even shut our borders to New Zealanders coming home for a good while there, and said no. And King Canute Light said, you will not come in, meaning the COVID virus. Well, that obviously worked. But the other aspect of the letter that I received from these informed academic leaders was that they didn't really want more tourists to come to this country. And we had, if you remember rightly, 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of those professors from Otago University Tourism School on here. I think it's the only impassioned argument I've had since I've been back on talk radio with anybody. I mean, I'm a bit of a free speech advocate, so I say, go for your life, and then you push back if you think they're wrong, and you have that discussion. But it was, I don't know, the concept that a whole series of academics who don't live in the area can come and tell people that tourism is bad for them and they don't like it, and that anything that encourages them to get jobs, which is why people live in Central Otago and the Lakes, is inherently bad because they want to save the world. I know. Now, he said, though, during that, that there was going to be a tourism or a New Zealand tourism conference, as there was a couple of weeks ago at in Queenstown. And that was fascinating. You might have seen some coverage of it. There wasn't extensive coverage. There certainly was in the economic side. But it does seem that New Zealand tourism is at a crossroads. On the one hand, New Zealand tourism sector is saying that it wants high-quality tourists to this country, but on the other hand has a model that pretty much relies upon people flying to this country, getting on a bus somewhere, tiki-touring around either individually or in an organised tour, and then flying out again. And that creates literally hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs and revenue for this country. Now, hosting that particular tourism school, that sort of project, if you like, attended by the new Minister of Tourism, Penny Hanare, was our next guest, Craig Stobo. Now, Craig, welcome Craig to the show, first of all. He's been hanging on. So, Craig, welcome. Good to hear from you again.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
Good, mate. Now, just to explain, Craig and I know each other from a long time, so get this out of the way. We went to university together. We're in the debating club together at Otago University, and he has gone on and had a much more illustrious career than I. you've been a diplomat, you've been a businessman, you are now a director and chair of, God, too many public companies, Craig. I don't know where you find your time, but then you were always like that. You had enormous amounts of energy, as I remember. And now you've ended up as, is it Taumata? Is that the word? Of the Otago University Tourism School. What the hell is a Taumata?
Well, business school. Yeah, well, it's advisor to the Otago University Business School, and as part of that role, I conceived and founded the Tourism Policy School, which in effect follows the tradition of the foreign policy school that Otago's run for over 50 years. And I thought, why don't I get academics, business people and policymakers in a room together and thrash out why do we have the policy settings we do? Because policy really matters for people's jobs, as we've found out in the last 3 years. So why do we have the settings that we have, and can we think of ways of doing things better at a venue where we can talk freely without feeling as though we have to pull our punches? So that's the background. And this year's one was the 5th school in Queenstown. Not great timing when you start a school in 2019 and you get locked down within a year, but we were full registered this year. And the topic this year was, are we fit for purpose? So we had a wonderful series of presentations, including Matt Claridge from Taurara Trail on Thursday afternoon, which is a free public lecture, and then Tim Elk from ex-MD Juicy, now Lilo, who spoke about his processing how to recover a business that was destroyed by lockdowns. And that was a harrowing story. But fortunately, the minister attended that dinner, formal dinner that Tim spoke at, and got a feeling for how much pain people have suffered having to manage businesses which have been wiped out by government policy.
Now, that is why you're on the show, and that's why we're talking this morning. I noted that you asked some questions on what I've seen reported, and it was pretty well reported as well. You tackled the new Tourism Minister, Pine Henare, and you basically said to him, listen, you've got 2-3 strategic papers that have been provided for you to direct strategy and policy from a government point of view. Where are they? And I'm paraphrasing, but I think his words were, next question. Is that right?
Yes, well, it's almost a correct paraphrase. So just by way of background for the listeners, the current government put out a government tourism strategy in 2019 that was shelved because of the border closures. There was a Tourism Futures Task Force, which was effectively people sourced from the business community and elsewhere, that presented a report in 2020. Minister Nash put that to one side. And then Simon Upton produced a report on behalf of the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment in 2021, and again was not heard. And now we're into a round of consultation for the tourism industry transformation plan with a focus on regenerative tourism and better work. But my wager is, again, that nothing will be implemented. So I sort of asked the minister, that looks like a lot of reports to nowhere. That was picked up by the media, thankfully. His answer was really around, well, you can take from all the previous reports that something will evolve over time into action. I'm just cynical about that. So, again, lots of willingness from the private sector, the business community, to contribute, because it matters for tourism businesses. But the government, so far, just by the weight of evidence, is not listening.
Okay, why are they not listening? And we'll come later on to the Auditor General's report, Craig, but I'm interested in, do they not think there's a problem? Is the official view of ministers, we quite want to go back to what was happening prior to 2020, plenty of people coming into this country, lots of money being made, lots of GST revenue being paid, it seemed to work?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of issues in there that you have to think about. And tourism is not particularly well defined as an industry. It's like a platform. A tourist comes into the country, then walks, travels, moves through various other industries, hospitality, restaurants, airlines, kayaking, businesses, etc. So it affects a lot of businesses at different parts of the economy. But the issues that we face were, and have been discussing, is the impact of decarbonisation issues that other countries are focusing on, which means long haul is an issue for New Zealand as a destination. We have issues around the disproportionate burden that towns like Queenstown or Fox Glacier face when tourism swells and they don't fund the infrastructure in those communities. You'll recall that Queenstown put forward a bed tax to try and fund infrastructure. It was voted in favour of by the public of Queenstown. But again, pre-2020, when there was general support by the Minister to try and advance that, nothing has happened. And I think the big issue right now, which is my second question to the Minister, is just labour shortages. And currently, while revenues are picking up as tourists come back, businesses can't find people to staff their businesses. So in particular, the smaller businesses are finding their owners are working in the business longer hours, and that's just unsustainable. You need workers. So the question I asked them around labour shortages, which was, to quote myself, was that Wellington doesn't really understand the size of the problem, or appears not to be listening, because if you look at the numbers, pre-lockdown, so 2019, we had approximately 340,000 temporary work or working holiday visa holders in this country. Mid-lockdown, we got to a low of 120,000. And the Immigration Minister Wood announced last year that around 35,000 new visas had been approved, but only 17,000 visas holders came into the country. That's nowhere near where we were pre-lockdown. So you can understand why businesses are just, pumped or closing or doing part-time openings because they just can't find the staff. And the Minister's response was, I'm listening and I'll talk to the Immigration Minister, but it's not just about processing time at the Ministry of Immigration or MD. It's not just about processing. It's a willingness to actively go out and find people. When I listen on the radio and hear the Victorian government appealing for teachers and nurses to come and work in Melbourne, I think, well, there's a country that wants people to come across and work for them. We are not doing that. We are not out there saying, come to New Zealand. It's a great place to live and work. And are our conditions for workers coming in really attractive, such that if I wanted a path of residency, is it easier to get? If I have to take sick leave or annual leave, can I get it earlier than what would be the case under current settings? So there's a whole lot of things in there, Michael, that sort of says to myself, well, actually, is the opportunity here to do something different, or are we going to allow this restricted environment to continue and squeeze the life out of our businesses that want to grow?
Okay, so the thing that automatically comes to me is, the Labor government, or particularly this ministry, have been quite accident prone. So, Stuart Nash has been through a few portfolios, it has to be said. So is Hanare, so is tourism as a general rule. Under the national government, you had John Key, who was the Prime Minister, also as the Minister of Tourism. So that would tend to give tourism quite a focus around a cabinet table when decisions are being made. Is one of the reasons the sort of revolving chairs you've got as Tourism Minister mean that this current cabinet doesn't see tourism as an important component of the economy?
It's probably easily answered by the fact that we've had three tourism ministers, Davis, Nash and Pini Hanare, and the current minister's ranking is lower than Nash's was as tourism minister. That might suggest that it isn't as important as other things on their agenda. Certainly when the previous government was in power, there was contemplation of, I think, a tourist number of 6 million people was put out there as a number that we should aim for. And I think that's one of the policy questions is, do we want lots more tourists and the issues that creates at that level, or do we want to think about doing things differently around charging those tourists more for the services they use? So I think that's where we need to get to as a policy debate rather than going for a volume response. I'm not sure that serves us at all well.
Well,
so
let's talk about the volume.
Government has a focus looking at.
Okay, so all right, so we know. Okay, so I guess what we define at the moment, then, Craig, is that politically tourism is not a priority for this country, for this particular administration, despite its overall and critical importance to the economy. But then that relates to the second one. I'm listening to you, and I listen to the head of Otago's Tourism Policy School and the argument that we had over Taras Airport, and I'm noticing a difference in even academic approach to tourism. When I was listening to your fellow colleague, his primary argument seemed to be that New Zealand tourism needed to change so that we could save the world from climate change. And that's the reason why you wouldn't want to build a new airport at Taras. You're saying, I want more workers to come into the hospitality sector now, because otherwise we're going to watch tourism businesses go to the wall. And those two are quite different messages, and they seem contrasting to me.
Well, I think they're both issues that are under discussion. Clearly, we may not be able to manage preferences expressed by other countries who are looking at climate change in their own environments, and that affects the way people travel. We are a long-haul distance destination. I think Queenstown Airport, for example, is well positioned, as the CEO described to me at the Tourism Policy School, where they are a short-haul destination. So tourists out of Australia or the islands or the North Island coming down to Queenstown makes more sense from a climate impact perspective or emissions perspective than travellers from other parts of the world. But they may be issues that are confronted by those citizens and not ourselves. So when we look at our own emissions regime, that emissions trading scheme, we will have all people, whether they're domestic or international tourists, who will face higher costs due to carbon prices impacting us through the ETS. So those price signals will detect, will ensure that people make their own decisions about where they want to come here. So Professor James Himes, reflecting the talk that's going around the academic community now around climate change and how that may affect tourism, it's not going to stop tourism. It's just going to change the way that people come in and what they decide to use and how long they stay.
Well, can I give an example of that, though, and what seems to me an absurdity from an outside perspective? Queenstown says it's going to be carbon neutral by 2030. And I'm thinking, how can that be? You're flying in repeated numbers of people from overseas. We've got, all sorts of petrol and diesel vehicles which take you from Queenstown to the destinations or the places you want to go. This is madness. There won't be enough electric car fleet to replace everything by 2030. These seem specious nonsense to me, Craig.
I would agree in the sense that it's hard to achieve a target like that in isolation, isn't it? Like no man is an island. How Queenstown can possibly expect to do that without thinking about the system as a whole is kind of naive, isn't it?
Well, that's the way it would strike both of us then. Listen, the other thing, mate, before we go on to the Auditor General's report, because and that's critical and it makes me very angry. I read it and I'm so glad you sent it to me yesterday. But it also seems to me the argument about tourism is we want people to come here because of the economic value to the country. But Professor Higham was saying, yes, but we want a different type of tourist. So we don't want, you mentioned it as well, we don't want to rely upon volume. We want to rely upon, it's the old story about processing timber, really. We don't want to export our logs overseas. We want to make something with it. Well, guess what? Still in 2023, our primary export is logs. Yeah. New Zealand is already an expensive destination compared to other tourist destinations in the world. And as you point out, it's for many people a long haul to get here. Really, is it realistic to think that we are going to replace volume with people prepared to pay more for their tourism experience?
Well, I think that may be one lens that price effect will ensure that you get some sort of levelling of the numbers that come here, and that just may be, amongst other things, the rising cost of aviation gas. So it's just going to cost you more to get here. That will restrict some people, or they may choose to stay here longer. So I'm going to spend that amount of money, $3,500 to get to New Zealand, and I'm going to spend 5 weeks here, not 2 weeks here. But the thing that you touched on that I think is really important to talk about is this kind of whiff of a discussion around values, as in what type of tourists should come here. And I think that's a very dangerous area to move into. Who are we to say that you can come here and you can't? I think you're on very dangerous ground there. So I don't want to see that type of approach to regulating or bringing in some sort of quotas based on what country you come from. I think that's the wrong approach. But I think the price mechanism is a very good way of sifting through who can afford to come here, and the way they stay here will change.
I'm delighted to hear that. That's common sense to me, Craig. All right, now the next issue. There are so many, and I didn't know that until I lived here, and I guess you're probably the same once you got into the tourism sector. So many of the tourism companies that are providing those services in this country are international, are owned by overseas interests, and they have, if you like, a continuum. They go from an interest, they fly them in, they go onto a bus owned by a bus company, stay at hotels owned by that same company, they go to tourist experiences that are owned or at least co-managed or partly managed by that same company, and then they go out again. So there's no way to stop that, is there?
No, it's a choice that consumers have, a kind of end-to-end experience when you do a group booking or a block booking. It's very common in overseas markets such as London. You pick up an end-to-end experience. You go to Ibiza, you get a cut rate on the deal, but everything's catered for. The hotel, the flights, the bars, or whatever it is. It's a very cheap way for lots of people to get to another country. So I can't see that changing. I think things have changed a lot due to lockdown. People are evaluating what types of businesses they want to be in, what parts of that value chain. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue that we need to be worried about as long as there's plenty of competition. There's still lots of people fly here solo. They come in, they grab a camper van and they walk around our tracks. They visit destinations that are not commonly used by other tourists, and they look for those experiences where they meet New Zealanders. And don't forget, it's not just an economic experience. There's a two-way experience here where New Zealanders meet a lot of really interesting foreigners who come here with ideas and compliments. So it really is a hospitality industry.
All right, now yesterday you sent me, and I have never seen it. Now I wonder, and I like to think that I'm abreast of the news. Obviously, I need to be in this particular job, but I've never seen what you sent me yesterday, which is the Auditor General's report to Parliament. John Ryan, the Controller and Auditor General. It's dated the 24th of March 2022. Today is the 5th of April, so it's about 10 days old. Complaining.
It was actually published. It was actually published in April last year, 1 week after our last tourism policy school, and I was similarly angry about it. Right, so it's like a year old, but I raised it as an issue with the new minister, and I think that's the point we want to talk about.
Yes, indeed. Can I just explain to people what it is? Sorry, you're right. It's more than 10 days. It's a year and 10 days old. But it is. A number of people remember. I'll just put it into context for our listeners, Craig, and you can add to that as well too, please, if you just jump in when you feel you need to. When the border was closed, a number of tourist destinations in this country, I can remember the bungee jumping of AJ Hackett was one of them, but there were others, said, we are going out of business. You've stopped our only revenue source, which is tourists. We are going to close down, and frankly, when you finally decide to open up New Zealand, we won't be here. So you're destroying it for all time. You're atomising these businesses. And the government of the time said, you got a point. I hadn't thought about that. And so they created a fund of 400 million, I think initially, called the Strategic Tourism Assets Protection Program, and the aim was to identify those businesses that needed to be propped up. Now, the Auditor General's overview was into that expenditure and revenue, yeah?
So it's a 400 million program for a range of things. 290 million of that was for this particular program, which was funding for what was called, quote unquote, strategic tourism businesses. And through the course of sort of May April, May, June 2020, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment was tasked with putting out expressions of interest, and then applications were received, and away we go. So at the end of that process, there were 127 tourism business funded by either grants or loans for 5 years, and that amounted to around 68, I think, million of grants, and about 104 million or so of loans finally went out the door. You're right about some businesses that got applications in before all the applications closed, which is what the report does discuss in its final version. And they included AJ Hackett, from memory, Whale Watch, Kokura, and I think Waitomo as well, were deemed to be strategic, and they got funding before the applications closed, which is one of the questions John Ryan, the Auditor General, brought to light. Now, just for your readers or listeners, the Office of the Auditor General is a parliamentary office. It reports to Parliament. It is not accountable to political parties, so it is completely independent. And in fact, it works for us. It works for us as a guardian of public expenditure. When you think about $150 billion of public money spent in every year, pretty important someone runs their eye over that with their annual audits or performance audits. So someone clearly complained to John Ryan, and he deemed it worthy enough to do an investigation, which is why it took a year or so, or more than that actually, because it came out in 2022 last year. But the report was interesting. Now, I'm not going to use that word. It's a bad word to use because it's so beige in New Zealand. But it was indicative of fault lines in our management of public money. And that is of concern to me as a taxpayer. So I asked the Minister, has he read the report? And he said, no, he hasn't. And I said, well, in the report, it clearly says a number of things we're going to talk about. One of them at the end of that was that recommendation by John Ryan that the MB should undertake a review. And that hasn't happened either. And I thought that was very poor accountability. I mean, the things that were raised in that report were the unclear criteria under which the funds were dispersed. And the public can go onto the MB website and look into tourism and see the STAPP, Strategic Tourist Assets Protection Program, and see the businesses. They're all listed there with grants and loans. But one of the criteria was that those businesses that applied had to have exhausted all other avenues of support. And John Ryan, his findings concluded that that was not done. It was just not possible at the time, in the time available for officials to be able to get that information to verify that. I think the second point was that there was no transparent, consistent methodology for deciding the amounts awarded. Why 1 million here or $500,000 there? Why those varying amounts? Officials, to their credit, in July 2020 said that STAP should be stopped or at least diminished in size, because by that stage I think the wage subsidy program had come in. Things had moved on and the economy had come out of lockdown, or its first lockdown anyway, and things were a little bit brighter with domestic tourism. So officials, to their credit, said stop, but the ministers ignored that advice. And part of the queries around that officials had was, what is a strategic asset? What does that mean? How do I choose that asset over another? And, would a business survive without STAP? And how many businesses do we fund? So none of these were easy questions to answer, but the minister decided to keep on. And so they funded all businesses that met a minimum threshold of 15 out of 30, which is the criteria. So you had to get 15 out of 30 to be able to be qualified for the funding. But what astounded me was that all Maori businesses, all eligible Maori businesses were funded. And I think, why the discrimination? So when I read this out to the minister, I didn't get any response, and none of the press articles were able to enunciate that either. They discussed other parts of the Q&A, but not that. And I find that difficult to accept. So on a number of points, this describes to me a situation where officials were not listened to, discrimination occurred, and there's no accountability, and we have no we have no understanding of whether we've learned anything from this and make sure it doesn't happen again. So I'm empathetic with John Ryan and his approach. I have a lot of time for the work that he does, but it must be incredibly unsatisfying for him to do this work, put the report into Parliament and not get any response. And I get the same answers from Minister Henry, and I think that's not doing a good job. Ministers aren't doing a good job for us as taxpayers.
We talk about wokeism a lot these days. It's become a sort of pejorative phrase for something that seems to be progressive but ignores conventions of the past. This would seem to fit that definition, Craig, that all tourism industries, before they got access to public funding, would have to meet a criteria. But if you're a Maori business, you didn't. Has that ever been explained to you as to why there would be that kind of racial discrimination?
No, and I think it's incumbent upon the ministers, and bear in mind there was 4 from memory, tourism recovery ministers, finance, Maori development, conservation and tourism. Four responsible ministers. They need to be queried as to why they allowed this to happen this way. Please explain. But the minister's response was the way we push money out the door to support communities doesn't fit within what would be the normal guidelines of the OAG. And that may be a paraphrase or it may be a quote, but it's pretty close to, I think, what the minister said. We made, he said, I think, and I believe, the right decision at that point in time, and I stand by that decision. That seems obstinate to me and lacks flexibility and a willingness to contemplate a mistake. We can make a mistake and move on, but to ignore what has gone on and, in particular, ignore the Office of the Auditor General, who is the watchdog for taxpayers, is reprehensible.
Indeed.
So I agree with you. I wonder aloud. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I wonder aloud again what system, quote unquote, is new that ignores the wise distribution of public cash.
Well,
what is that?
Yeah, it's a good question too. And obviously that question has been asked for a lot more than just tourism, right across the board, I have to say too. Finally, Craig, can I just ask you about something else too? You are also in another, you have another hat. You are the you're the chairman of, I think it's New Zealand Wind Farms. It's the wind farm. We were just talking about Palmerston North this morning, actually. That's the one. Are you one of those wind farms, or do you own all of those pylons on the Palmerston North skyline?
Yeah, we're an owner of one block behind Palmerston North on the hillsides. Facing west, we've got 92 odd turbines that produce renewable energy, and we're a wholesale merchant, so we sell into the network at spot or forward prices, 100% renewable, listed on the NZX, and it's public knowledge that we're going through a repowering consent process, a fast-track consent process, to enable us to redevelop the existing site with more powerful, more efficient turbines to enable us to produce more power for the New Zealand communities.
So I assume they'll be bigger, is that right?
Yeah, taller, much taller, 90 metres, 3 blades as opposed to 2 blades. A smaller number, but much greater output in terms of electricity.
Now, electricity is meant to be the saviour of, for some strange reason, New Zealand's environmental future. And obviously we're talking about, massive expenditure like Lake Onslow as part of that equation. Mm-hmm. Wind farms, have we reached peak wind farm yet?
I don't believe so, no. If you just gauge into the future and see what the NZ Super Fund is doing with its investigation of offshore wind farms and the Taranaki Bight, it's not just onshore, but it's offshore. The constraint that's been discussed on the platform for a few days now is the RMA. We're fortunate that we're going through a fast-track consent process. Why you'd ever want to go back to slow-track consent process is beyond me. But fast track still requires the minister to give the process a heavy shove. So it still requires ministerial direction, which I'm not particularly enamoured of as a process for everybody having to go through a minister. It's not what we want to get to. But the RMA is a considerable constraint for the developers if they're looking at greenfields, that is new pieces of land, and then hooking up to the grid. So we face a huge cost of development issue in producing or starting new renewable energy sites, not just wind but also solar and hydro for that matter, if you can ever envisage another dam in the country, which is hard to envisage.
Well, and for me, that seems the obvious solution in some ways to many of these things. I mean, we're talking about spending $4 billion plus, and that's just now, Craig, on a battery dam at Lake Onslow. Yep. And you just think, wow,
I think you had one of your previous speakers from Mineral was spot on in the sense that Onslow is in the wrong place. It's the Minister of Energy spoke at the Downstream Energy Conference in Wellington last week, and it seems as though the current regime, the government's shifted from the battery project to the battery project plus other opportunities and other sites. And Transpower and others have highlighted the fact that we don't have the transmission bandwidth anyway to get the power from Onslow up to the North Island where it's needed. So it's in the wrong place. And from a developer's perspective, if we have a government-run entity that can switch on a battery to cap prices, and I don't know what point they would cap them. I don't know whether it's at $97 or $110. I don't know. But if they had the ability to cap, it just creates a whole lot of uncertainty. Why would you put scarce capital at risk to build a site that produces the energy that's subject to a government price control? It just seems nuts to me.
Oh, Craig, you talk so much sense. You should have got into politics, mate. But then you've still got time, I suppose, have you, or not?
I'm very busy with portfolio work that I do at the moment, and I'm very happy to provide a rational, thought process. Critical thinking is what I like to call it, Michael, on your show. I'm sure lots of other listeners like to hear, explanations of these sorts of things, and I'm very happy to try and help. So it's been enjoyable providing it to you and supporting people that are thinking aloud around why do we do the things we do? Can't we do them more properly? So the officials at MB who raised questions to the ministers, good on them. Good on John Ryan, the Officer of the Auditor General, doing his job, saying why do we allow this type of expenditure to happen this way? What's not happening is some accountability at the top to explain to the public why they've done things the way they have. Spot on.
Thank you, Craig. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. We hope to talk to you again soon, and best wishes, my friend. All right, that is Craig Stobo. He is taumata, that's a Maori word for essentially a patron, if you like. He gave you of the Otago Business School, Otago University Business School. He's obviously the co-founder or the founder of the tourism policy network, if you like, conference that has been over the last 5 years. As he said, 3 years, that 5 years has been a bit difficult. And he was also the chief or the chairman of New Zealand Wind Farms and a variety of other commercial or corporate. He's probably our most credentialed business leader that we've had on the platform since our formation. In fact, he would be the most credentialed business leader we've had on. He would be right up there. He got a first-class honours, I remember that, in economics, same year that I got mine. He got it in economics, I got mine in history from Otago University, went on, studied, and then went into the private sector, has a glittering and seriously august business career. Also been a diplomat overseas as well. In fact, that's somewhere else I met Craig now I think about it. He worked in the New Zealand Embassy at Washington, D.C. We will take him as an informed observer going forward in months to come. You'll hear a bit more of him. But can I just say, on that tourism sector, it also provided a balance to Professor James Hyam's argument that in actual fact we shouldn't be flying people in New Zealand, and you go, how else are they going to get here? But also he's highlighted the nature of policy making from this government in tourism as well. And he's highlighted the Auditor General's report that said, essentially, you didn't have any rules. You didn't have any ideas. You just got that $400 million out the front door. There was no accountability for that spending. And when your own officials came back and said, this isn't the right way we're doing things, they said, damn the torpedoes, carry on anyhow. And that included the direct racial favouring of Maori businesses over non-Maori in this country. Now, I don't care how woke you are, but if you can defend that, then you are not defending democratic values or taxpayer accountability or anything that looks like fairness or equity in New Zealand. It is 10 to 12.